clap very well.
We today are doing... Oh, hi, by the way. You're listening to Plastic Pill's voice on the Plastic Pills Pill Pod. We are talking today about more Frankfurt School. If you were with us last week... Oh, wait. Last week was a Patreon episode. If you're on the Patreon, you heard last week where we began talking about the Frankfurt School. And I think the conclusion from that episode was that Hegel caused the Holocaust. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. I mean, It took us a while to get there. It was a very dialectically circuitous route, but we all came to the right conclusion in the end.
Sure.
So Hegel caused the Holocaust. Maybe Nietzsche had a hand in it too. Something like that. Today, we are moving to, Nazis are defeated. We don't need to write about them anymore. The eclipse of reason is over. Or so you thought. But no. Now we are writing about America and American capitalism. So we're turning to Frankfurt School in the 50s and beyond. And, the evils of capitalism and the effects it has on the psyche. Speaking of psyches, did you guys watch this debate in the crumbling empire to the south?
I did not.
I did. It was probably the greatest spectator sport I've ever seen. And I was torn between high levels of anxiety about the fall of Rome and what's going to mean for all of us, and almost overwhelming joy at the sheer entertainment value of the spectacle. So
yeah, I heard it was like a real failed state kind of vibe going on there.
I was getting King Lear vibes, but it's like if King Lear had a boxing match against King Lear from like the third act of the play.
Oh yeah, Trump was like, I kid you not, like one insult away from being, and my dick's bigger than yours, bitch. Like one insult away. If like Chris Wallace hadn't stepped in and been like, okay, you've attacked his son, his intelligence, drug habits, enough is enough, right?
And we're speaking as denizens of a city with a crack-smoking mayor, too. And even we were
citizens of a city with a crack-smoking mayor. Okay.
Although not all of us are denizens of a city of a crack-smoking mayor, today with us as a guest, we have... can I call you an Adorno scholar? Is that the...
Sure.
The region of expertise? The regime?
Cultural historian.
Okay, cultural historian, influenced at least
fancier.
in part by Adorno. It's SHALON. Hi, SHALON.
Hi.
If you're familiar with the Plastic Pills canon, I did a video on the culture industry, which was co-written, or mostly written, if we're being honest, mostly written by SHALON, who I've worked with before. So we're excited to have her here again to deal with Frankfurt School.
Thanks for having me on.
Woo! Yeah.
Oh, and SHALON, would you like to mention to our listeners, if they go to your blog, which I will link here, if they go there, what will they find and what awaits them?
Sure. So my blog is on my website, shalonvantine.com, and my blog is Second as Farce. And anything that I do and related to podcast or articles, I always throw up there. So people can follow my work if they want by going there.
I should also say SHALON has very good taste in film, and she has a very, very long list of all the movies that you should ever watch. Very long list. So if you're ever sitting there on a date night and you're not
definitely
sure
check
what
that out.
You should put on.
Better than Adorno.
It also might be an advisable thing to go check that out.
All right, I haven't seen that part of your blog yet.
Oh, really? I think the first thing I ever saw. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
I'll have to lurk it.
Okay, lurk Shannon's blog. We finished, I guess, where did we leave off, guys? If you can help me. We finished talking about Benjamin because he was unfortunately suicided.
We also were talking about whether or not there's any kind of normative lessons to be drawn from critical theory, particularly Frankfurt School critical theory, or if it's only going to ever be critical. And we split to a certain extent between the kind of soft liberals, as Victor and I sometimes pose ourselves, and, the more hard-edged
I think maybe soft socialists. Social democrat.
Liberal socialism. Again.
And Shalon, I'm going to ask you to fill in the names that I forget here. But what we've already covered, at least in part, usually during the immediately after the Second World War. Now we're moving into 1950s. But Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse. Who else am I missing in there?
Eric Fromm.
Karl Lowenthal.
And Lowenthal, yeah.
What's that? There's another guy's
name
in
Paul
there.
Newman. Or not,
Neumann?
Neumann.
And then we have like the second generation, which includes people like Martin Jay and Habermas.
Habermas was pretty significant.
And I should probably note that when people think about the Frankfurt School, the initial Frankfurt School was explicitly Marxist, and even though they all had very distinct philosophies, but when you get into the later Frankfurt School, like Habermas and Honeth and those, they tend to go more liberal. So there's a big shift in the thought.
Yeah, they diverge in various ways, don't they? We kind of spoke about how Horkheimer, after that first guy, I forget his name, who the fuck cares about him? After Horkheimer sort of like laid down the research program, that kind of lasted pretty much all the way. Habermas was really the first guy to kind of break away from that, like really explicitly. Like, of course, there were different positions within the Frankfurt School, and World War II kind of split them up and sent them all over the place. But Habermas was the one to sort of explicitly diverge from Horkheimer's research program from the 30s, I guess.
Eric Haynes, if you're listening, this one's for you. Thanks, bro.
I just wanted to fanboy for a second and say that I was really happy Eric Fromm was brought up, since he's usually the person I see least referred to as a prominent member of the Frankfurt School. And I actually have always found his work extremely informative and interesting, since of all of the major figures, he's the only one I could think of who actually really was able to successfully pull off, at least marginally, a synthesis of Freud and Marxism in something like The Sane Society. I actually find that book a lot more cogent than even something like Eros and Civilization. So here's to Fromm. May we do our best to actually resuscitate his reputation.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'd be that person. I mean, Fromm, in many ways differed from Marcuse and Adorno and Horkheimer, and they sort of rejected a lot of his ideas because he strayed from Freudian theory. He rejected a lot of the core Freudian concepts about the psyche, and instead sort of shifted more towards the existentialist thinkers, Sartre and those. So he's more of a melding of existentialism and Marxism than, I would say, a melding of Freud and Marx.
Fucking traitor.
I would certainly agree, although I don't think that he ever actually was shied away from that, because he acknowledged at a number of points that he thought Marx was a far more important figure than somebody like Freud, right? And the kind of analytic that he took from Freud was more about this idea, from my in my imagination, that the psyche always is distorted, and it tends to act out its distortions and symptoms in sometimes extraordinarily antisocial ways via the authoritarian personality and stuff. But we should probably wait to get into that.
There's also a few curveballs out there with the actual publication history of Marx's texts. So stay with me, listeners. But like the Grundrisse, like Marx's other sort of major late work, and those 1844 humanist manuscripts, they were done a bit earlier in Marx's life, 1844, in fact. Those were not published until the 1930s. So you also have this like dynamic where like different texts by Marx are becoming available at different points in the 20th century as well, which makes it really confusing to sort of follow the critical theory and the development of, or the way they use Marx, because these texts are popping up. And this is just in German too. Like the Grundrisse wasn't even translated into English until like the 1960s or 70s, and the 1844 manuscripts weren't available in English until much later as well. Like there's some weird textual history going on there. You have to look it up.
Well, the English usually they're very pious, so they had problems with publishing research notes. It's my hypothesis.
Yeah, and I think that Marcuse was one of the early people to start commenting. I believe he reviewed the economic manuscripts when they were published, and he was one of the first people to really start to use those early Marx writings. And they're really important for critical theory generally because those are writings where they're talking a lot about alienation, and Marx is talking a lot about the effect of culture on our material existence. And so those are key ideas that you see with the early Frankfurt School, at least, which is that, instead of just focusing on a sort of vulgar Marxism where it's purely economic, they are dealing now with the ways that culture affects our material life.
Mm-hmm.
That publication history is important, like Eric said.
Yeah, and you get these later guys too that come to Marx, like Althusser and Etienne Balibar. And I'm not sure if this goes for Etienne Balibar as well, but Althusser really just rejected the earlier Marxist works. Like he just did not like Marxist humanism at all. He just divided Marx up into like 3 stages, said the late stage was the best and most mature and most like comprehensive stage, fuck the other ones. And he was just hardcore structural Marxist. So I guess the point is like big disagreements within everyone who's looking at Marx and reading Marx. Nobody can get along. Nobody can really, it's a good thing in a way because you have all these different perspectives and takes, and there's no unified front really. And then at the whole time you had the more politically engaged Marxists and the Leninist Marxists, and then you had the sort of old school idealist Hegelian Marxists. It's a mess. We'll work it out a little bit today,
okay.
Maybe.
Let me try to establish a little bit of a plan. The boys here have divided up the texts. Eric having read a dork, I read Marcuse, and Matt having done Habermas, if I'm not mistaken. Shalon, you're the heavyweight. Sorry, the intellectual heavyweight here. So we didn't give you an assignment. So you can be the glue that weaves our disparate narratives together. But continuing from last week, again, this is where psychoanalysis and Marxism are very much fused. And generally the reason for that in our narrative here is that, so much of Europe was poised, it seemed, to turn to Marxism in the 1930s, America as well, with organized labor movements, and yet they turned to fascism. And then later during the 50s, during this Marshall Plan reconstruction, very much into state capitalism with the Marshall Plan and Keynesian economics. So I think the purpose of recruiting Freud in here is to try to explain why people opt into market relationships that don't benefit them and even that harm them in the case of fascism.
And also to understand the psychological effects of, say, in Adorno's case, the culture industry on the people who are sort of captured by it, right? Like there's that sort of deep psychological level that Freud provided some resources or tools to sort of describe the idea of the superego, for example, as like internalizing rules and regulations, and just various like ideas about depth psychology and how to describe society with an also filled out sort of psychological theory as well.
I would also say like the text Civilization and Its Discontents, right, in the aftermath of the First World War was probably the most important formative influence on the Frankfurt School. Because, Freud even in that text acknowledges that this is very speculative, which coming from Freud really means something, right? But oddly enough, I actually find it one of his more imaginative texts, and he's really taking a stab at social psychology. And some of the ruminations he comes up with are shocking and provocative in the best possible way.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think it's one of the great texts, and that is a really influential one on on the Frankfurt School. And it, like you said, Matt, it's also where Freud kind of becomes more of a philosopher of culture rather than strictly a psychoanalyst. But to what Eric was saying with, the culture industry, I mean, I think that the inclusion of Freud is important at this point in time for the Frankfurt School, because you have both the culture industry, which is gaining dominance and control over society in new ways. But also you have the Frankfurt School looking at the psychological effects of fascism. So you have people like Wilhelm Reich, and who is exploring fascism from a psychological angle. And, where you have people who've analyzed fascism from, Neumann that we talked about earlier, looked at fascism in his book Behemoth, where he looked at more of the political side of fascism. And you have Marxists who have looked at fascism from a Marxist economic perspective. But the Frankfurt School were really kind of the first people to look at fascism and see, what kind of makes up the psyche of someone who becomes a fascist. Now, they're not, of course, saying that these are the only reasons, but it is supplemental. It's a complement to the already existing Marxist theories about the rise of fascism.
So I'll just plug in for that too, that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the way that they use Freud. I came across some quotes actually of Habermas being a little condescending towards the earlier Frankfurt School, just saying that all Freud was he just allowed them to use this mechanism of internalization from Freud, and that's all he was good for. And these earlier, what he calls Freudo-Marxists, but really they have a theory about the way that capitalism shapes subjectivity. So one of the key things about Marxism in the Frankfurt School is that they felt it lacked a theory of the subject. And Freud also sort of helped give birth to this theory of the subject and the way that individuals are already shaped by capitalist ideology. It's also a psychological system that produces a certain kind of subjectivity. And they're not just talking about the ways that certain things become internalized, although that's part of it, I guess. But that's a very simplistic reading of the way that the early Frankfurt School guys used Freud, courtesy of Habermas, who's great, but he also isn't right about everything, just because he's the second generation leader, although he was very bright.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I just want to interject and say one thing in response to that. Not to defend Habermas, because I think he's actually wrong on this point. And I agree with Zizek's criticism of him on this. But long story short, what Habermas is doing is actually insisting that the problem with appealing to Freud was precisely the fact that he grants his theory of subjectivity and reintegrates the philosophy of the subject into Marxist theory, when what he's trying to do is move away from the philosophy of the subject towards a communicative, pragmatic orientation. And he feels that Freud was sometimes, a good contribution to that, but also tended to recalcify certain hardened expectations that the Frankfurt Schoolers would have been better off moving away from, right? So it is more than just condescension, right? There's actually a kind of philosophical disagreement about whether subjectivity should be placed at the epicenter of critical theory.
And we're talking about how they're using Freud and using Freud's subjectivity, but if we could just specify this a little bit, I'll start because I have at least one way, and that's with the concept of repression. So repression for Freud is you have a desire. As soon as that desire is repressed, for example, in the Oedipal complex, as soon as it's repressed, it's going to act out in different ways. It's going to be a symptom for neuroses or violence or disassociation in some way or projection. And one way that at least Marcuse, who I read today, uses this is saying that your creativity is repressed in your leisure time because capitalism isn't just happy taking your work time and taking that from you. It also wants to shove a bunch of products into your leisure time so that your actual ability to be creative is then repressed throughout your whole life. Is there any others specific concepts from Freud that get deployed here?
Yeah, so I mean, two things on that. One, this is also where Marcuse, just to note, this is also where Marcuse begins to sort of differ from people like Adorno and Horkheimer, at least early Horkheimer. Because when you look at Adorno's critiques of the culture industry, those use more Marx than Freud, I would argue. The culture industry essentially creates these sorts of forms of catharsis that make us sort of passive, and we won't want to revolt against the system. So there's very much a Marxist critique of the culture industry from Adorno. When you get to Marcuse, and he starts to sort of differ in his interpretation of Freud, he is dealing more with repression at the more individual level. So that whereas the Freudians before would seek to balance out the ego, Marcuse is wanting to sort of boost up the id, boost up our animal instincts, the things that we want to do, but we're repressed because of whatever reasons, societal reasons, psychological reasons, whatever. And this is why Marcuse ended up being a key figure for the New Left in the 1960s, because the New Left started to sort of shift away from an old form of Marxism that focused mostly on mass organization of the working class towards a kind of liberation of the self, which we always remember in the 60s, but actually came out especially more so in the 70s. And Marcuse was sort of their hero because he was trying to get people to get rid of this sense of repression so that they could free up their id. This is why he became a very big influence on people like Norman O. Brown and some of these other psychoanalysts and cultural critics later on. But this is also where he kind of differs from Adorno, where Adorno's making a much more Marxist critique of the culture industry. Marcuse is making a more Freudian critique of the culture industry, I would argue.
Yeah, that's true.
Can I just ask a quick question? Just because we have discussed Nietzsche and Heidegger at some length before, and we haven't really dived very deeply into Heidegger's theory of authenticity and its association with fascism and so on. But could you explain what differentiates Marcuse's idea of liberating the id from Heideggerian ideas of authenticity or being your true self, if you want to use the more colloquial term? And I say this also because for historical reasons, it's pretty controversial since, of course, Heidegger was a formative influence on the early Marcuses.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of, that would be a question for somebody else because I don't know too much about Heidegger in that regard. I know that Marcuse, studied Heidegger and tried to sort of meld Heidegger and Marx, but I don't know much about that.
Okay. I can wager to answer that in terms of one of the sort of controversial things about Heidegger is his sense of rootedness and also the sense of getting away from of technological sort of cosmopolitan life. And I think that comes out in Marcuse because Marcuse is very preoccupied with leisure time and what you do with your leisure time. So whereas a lot of Marxist theory deals with labor time and how labor itself is alienated, and leisure time is part of Marxist theory as well, because he says in leisure you only become an animal basically because you're tired of having worked all day. And this lines up with Heidegger's sort of retreat phase, because he was banned from teaching, but his retreat phase and saying the authentic is to create spaces for thinking. And one of the things you have to do to think is be bored, not have a bunch of products to consume, a bunch of media to consume constantly. So this is like the cabin in the woods. Heidegger fits up very well with Marcuse's thoughts about using your leisure time to be creative. But for it to be creative, You have to not be in a rat race the rest of the day trying to increase your profit and get product, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to take a swing at that. I don't know. Like Heidegger has his own version of alienation, right? Which has to do with being alienated from authentic being and being sort of captured by the crowd or Das Man, right? So we're all radically fallen state. And yeah, that's like I have nothing prepared to talk about Heidegger in this context because I mean he's like Adorno criticizes Heidegger, like he just seems radically incompatible with what we're going to be talking about in a way.
Well, that's the reason I brought him up. And I mean, we don't have to pursue this line of inquiry because I'm sure that there's more interesting things to talk about. It's just that there was a big controversy, I think in the 1930s, since Marcuse acknowledged the fact that he was highly influenced by Heidegger, and then Heidegger was a Nazi. And unlike Adorno, who was almost immediately and scathingly critical of the whole Heideggerian apparatus, Marcuse, ever after displayed some kind of sympathy to the project of existential analysis, which is why there's controversies and inquiries into the extent of this influence, right?
All right. Before we took this divergence, I was asking about Freud, and no one brought it up, so I'll throw it to you after I bring it up. But the concept of ideology, and not the concept that people use today. Actually, I have an anecdote about this, and that one of my committee members, while I was writing my dissertation, pretty much said outright, I am not allowed to use the word ideology because it's too confused and I would have to spend too much time defining it. I did anyway, but ideology does not just mean the political beliefs that you choose, especially for the Frankfurt School. It means the political beliefs that you don't choose. So in reference to Marcuse, the ideology that he focuses on is that we already do enough work that we could stop working. Like if everyone worked 2 hours a day in an economy that has this much money, we'd all be fine. You wouldn't have all the goods to consume. You wouldn't have all the luxury goods and products. But if everyone just did their 2 hours, you'd pretty much have enough. And the ideology for him is that you always have to be growing profit and increasing profit. And yeah, that's a fetish. Like he thinks we should just like draw a line almost and stop working at a certain point. So in terms of ideology, where you add fetishes in Marx or Freud's terms, this is one of the words on which they both align. If you add fetishes to your actions, then how does that play out in like political life ideologically?
I was just going to bring up that when we talk about fetish with Marx, we're talking about commodity fetishism. So in the way we forget that everyday products like our clothing, or this was actually touched on in Pills's Marx and Alienation video, but it's fetishism is kind of the way we forget that there's like a modicum of labor that goes into everything that we use, all the products that we buy, and everything that is all, say, objectified labor by the laboring class who are being exploited under capitalism, right? And when we fall under the spell of commodity fetishism, we sort of forget that is what is happening all around us. Everything is built by somebody, everything is made by somebody, everything is invested in by people's labor and time. Whereas with the Freudian version of fetishism, I don't know if this word helps, but cathexis, it means the investment of libidinal energy, like when you have like a keepsake or something you just don't want to throw away because it has too much sentimental value. Like that's a cathexis. That's the investment of some kind of psychic energy into something. And I think that has to do with fetishism, but also it has a sexual meaning too.
Right.
Like if you want to explain like a foot fetish,
yeah,
like that is also a kind of investment of libidinal energy, and it's displaced onto a certain object. So supposedly at some point in your life you had some kind of developmental issue, maybe you didn't really complete the anal phase properly or something like that, and you displace all of this sexual psychic energy onto some object that, well, in the terms of not completing the anal phase, it means you become anal retentive. I guess I'm probably doing some kind of horrible stereotype here, but you become anal retentive. You become a fucking prude, right? That's how it works, kind of.
Yeah, this is gonna cash out in the culture industry stuff as well. But basically, a fetish in both cases, a fetish has to do with a partial object, and the rest of that object is supplemented by your desire. So there's a surplus desire for the object that doesn't actually have to do with it. And we could talk about, branding and, luxury goods as fetishized objects, but the fetish just means you desire it more than there's any use in the actual object, whether that's sexual or just like,
and of course,
a status symbol.
Libidinal, vital.
Of course, also anthropological too, is where both of them are getting that phrase. But I would say that the culture industry is probably I know this is what I always go back to, but it is such a good example of, this kind of idea, because you have, in Marcuse's point of view, you have this kind of objectification that Marx talks about under capitalism, where people sort of begin to see themselves as like extensions of the objects that they're producing. Like they sort of see themselves as the objects that they've been sort of forced to produce. And capitalism sort of creates this sense of false needs, and this of course plays into the culture industry as well, so that you feel like you have to have all these things that the culture industry provides you. I mean, this is kind of the phenomenon, to give an example, when you see all these people who get excited about like every new shitty Marvel movie or whatever, and people even know that they're shit, but they like have to watch them. They like have to consume because it's like they feel like they have to, even if they don't even like them. So you get this sort of sense that there are these needs that people feel that need to be met. And this is again where the psychology of it comes into play, and how the culture industry manipulates our psychology, because it always supports capitalism in the end. And this is another aspect of the culture industry that I think people sort of miss, because they'll say, oh, can't some good art squeeze through the culture industry? Well, sure, like there can be good stuff that squeezes through, but that's sort of missing the point. The point is that the culture industry has one goal, not a main goal, but one goal, which is profit. And if your main goal is profit, again, put in another way to prop up capitalism, then you're always going to be limited in how good the art can be, and you're always going to be manipulated by the industry to make you think that you need the things that you don't, but you feel like you do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to switch things around for 2 seconds to talk about the production side of things in true Marxist fashion, right? Since we should always talk about productive processes, by suggesting this isn't some kind of conspiratorial effort on the part of the capitalist class to brainwash or delude the lower classes by upping them full of hockey and lottery, lottery games and Marvel films, right? These people may very sincerely feel that they're invested in producing a product and this will produce a certain degree of happiness, but nonetheless, it has this structural effect of diminishing a desire for reform by satisfying true human needs. But sometimes this is misinterpreted this way, right? In the sense that there's this giant cultural industry organized by Walt Disney, and they meet in some kind of dark castle in Transylvania, and they say, this is how we're going to elude the lower classes. And that's not what this is about, right?
Yeah, it's an accidental confluence of we could call this like a systems theory, pretty much. It's an accidental confluence of a million little decisions being made for the sake of profit that eventually turns into a situation where revolution is almost the most unimaginable consequence of this, right? Because needs that you don't even know you've ever had are being met before you even have them, and then you're too exhausted to ever, pick up your placard and storm the Bastille.
Yeah, one example that I really liked was the commodification of technology in the early 21st century. So people would sometimes ask, like, well, why is it that there's an iPhone 5, an iPhone 6, an iPhone 7, and what are actually the differences between each of these? And if you actually were to interrogate it, there's not really a substantial difference between each of these generations. But what somebody like Steve Jobs was very successfully able to do was create a need to be at the cutting edge of a technological revolution, as he put it.
You don't want to miss an episode. You can't binge a show without missing an episode.
And of course, if Adorno were here, he'd say, well, being at the cutting edge of this, quote, technological revolution means, of course, that you'll never actually engage in genuinely revolutionary activity, which would mean changing the mode of production to establish a more egalitarian society where real needs are able to be met, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
which isn't to say I don't like the iPhone. If Apple is listening, right, I do take endorsements.
Yeah. So that's basically there's a couple different, there's two different kinds of, there's human needs. First of all, there's that kind of need where what you need to survive. So when the capitalist class is running their factories, they know exactly how much money their workers need to survive and support their family and get enough calories per day to live on. But within the culture industry, it seems like to me that it's the creation of this new area of need where it's the need for consumption. Because what the capital industry does is it turns us into consumers. We're not just workers anymore making a living. We're now all also consumers. They make us into almost like employees in a way. I mean, Adorno talks about talent scouts and the way that the culture industry absorbs talent. But we also are made into consumers, which Marx points out is actually one of the areas of production. There's like three areas of production, right? There's the sort of extraction and manufacturing, there's distribution, and there's consumption. Those are the sorts of three areas of production. So it's kind of weird to think about consumption as production. But that's the end of the life cycle, right before the garbage can, I guess, of any product. So we are turned into consumers, and then on that basis, they need to create needs, which we need to compulsively fulfill by, buying magazines. I mean, his biggest examples are, film, magazines, radio, and these sorts of new mass media forms.
And I should add that this isn't an argument for aestheticism, right? It's not like Marcuse and Adorno are saying that what we should do is embrace some kind of stoic philosophy where we realize that we don't actually need all this crap and then go sit in a commune, dissociating ourselves from the world. What they're saying is that the problem with the way that the capitalist system and the culture industry organizes the production of needs is that we have genuine desires that aren't being fulfilled. They're being commodified, and we're giving a cheap iteration of what it is that we really want. So, for example, people really want genuine connection with other people, particularly like romantic partners, but let's just use other people in general, right? And they're unable to get that because they're working 12, 14 hours a day if you add up labor time at the home and so on and so forth. And to compensate for that fact, people will watch romantic movies about the man getting the girl and how happy he is, and everyone in the movie never seems to have to work because they're always hanging out at the cafe and dealing with each other's drama. And what Adorno would say is the movie has a real insight to it, right? Which is that people want human connection, but rather than telling you how it is that you could genuinely achieve it, which would be by transforming the conditions under which you live, which would allow you to spend more time with those people that you love and you care about, it's giving you a cheap substitute for it, which is just seek romantic love under the conditions of late capitalism. Make sure you have enough money that you can have plenty of leisure time and everything will be fine, right? So it's not an argument for aestheticism, which is what I think sometimes people interpret Adorno and Horkheimer especially as saying, right? That we should all stop wanting things. It's an argument for the fact that we aren't getting what we want out of capitalism. What we're getting is the substitute for it.
We're paying for further unhappiness. Yeah.
No, I was just going to agree with you, Matt, and just say that, people often think of Adorno as an elitist, which is a completely wrong way to think about him.
Yeah.
Because what he's actually saying is, one, like you pointed out earlier, the culture industry is a structural problem. You can't work within the culture industry. You can't work within capitalism to fix the problems of capitalism. The only solution to these problems is appending capitalism. So, he's making a very Marxist argument. It's not elitist at all. In fact, it's the opposite of that. For Adorno, we are not reaching our true potential as individuals because the oversight of capitalism completely dominates our lives. And the second point to what you were saying is that, Pills can probably say more about the notion of catharsis, but the culture industry specifically gives us ideas about revolution to pacify us. So one of the most recent examples is things like that Joker movie. Where, people are like, oh, look, this is like such a revolutionary movie. It's got all these revolutionary themes, which, I watched it and, it, I guess, had some light revolutionary themes, I guess. But you could also say they were reactionary. They just kind of were Hollywood, in my opinion. But that's a perfect example of how the industry feeds us little bits of like, oh, look, we know that the system sucks. So let me, as the culture industry, let me give you some stuff to make you feel like you're participating in resistance against the system by participating in this entertainment industry product. Like I said, Pills can probably talk a little bit more about the nature of catharsis and how that works within all this.
I was going to turn it to Eric since I interrupted him.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was hoping for other people to respond to this. I'll just throw this out there, okay, and say the main difference between, since we're on the topic of aesthetics, say Adorno and Marcuse. So Adorno's version of aesthetics is, okay, yes, he did get rejected maybe in the 60s, by the 70s, as a kind of elitist, because he did enjoy writers like Kafka and insanely complex composers like Schoenberg and Berg, who he was friends with. And this is because Adorno's version of aesthetics is a kind of bourgeois aesthetics, not bourgeois aesthetics, but the autonomy of the work of art. The work of art needs to provide a space in which the contradictions of real life, which the culture industry does not allow to be worked out to their full completion. It does not allow for, sublation, because as Adorno says in his Freudian Moments, the culture industry does not sublate, it represses, right? It shows you boobs and nice torsos of heroic people, and it just, those unsublimated desires, it plays with them. So Adorno says you need a sort of separate autonomous space in which art can work out these contradictions in a certain way. Whereas Marcuse, he gets picked up in the 1968 student revolutions, especially in Germany, because Marcuse's philosophy is seen as more friendly to popular art and to the way that we're going to find sublation in real life. We need to integrate art into the movement itself, into real life. And that's sort of the difference between Marcuse and Adorno. Adorno has this idea that art does need to be a little bit autonomous, whereas Marcuse is all for, art as a kind of, well, he has his theory of happiness and eros, and the way that art should not present an illusion world in which cultural ideals ideals are shown. No, that should be in real life. Art should feed movements and be something that we really like have. If I'm a part of a movement, maybe we'll have our representative artists who produce our pamphlets and our images and our memes and everything, and those go into the struggle. Whereas for Adorno, no, there's an autonomous realm of art which presents us with these nice cultural ideals, and we can actually see them in all their contradictions and all of their workings out. And that's where sublation happens, because sublation does not happen in the culture industry. That's where repression happens.
If you want to talk about drive theory, I think I can unify this with the catharsis angle, is that with drives seek a certain satisfaction. So you feel driven to eat because you're hungry, and that reduces the tension inside your body. Or you get horny, so you have to reduce that tension by getting laid. And this, if we're going to blow up Freud's theories to a macro level, we could talk about Joker or Black Panther as they respond to this intensity, this tension, and they're like, oh, the Oscars are too white for you. Okay, we'll give you this Black Panther movie. Then it wins the Oscars. Or you feel like there's social alienation that you need to respond to. There's angst. And like you said, Shalon, it's unclear who the Joker is for. Is it for leftists? Is it for incels? No, it's just for anyone who feels like a vague sense of alienation, doesn't know what to do with it. We're going to give you this to know that you're being heard, but you're going to pay for it also. And this contrasts with Adorno's theory of art, which is, no, we want to leave you in dissonance. We want to leave you not knowing what to do so that you can walk away from whatever it is you're walking away from and still feel that angst. Maybe you even get a more acute sense of angst.
Well, actually, I'd like to build on that by just saying one thing in response to Eric, which is that what he is also opposed to is reactionary responses to the contradictions of late capitalism, right? Which is something like what Heidegger would propose, right? Because you can look at movies like, say, No Country for Old Men or Into the Wild, and what they involve are typically male protagonists who retreat from society and its vulgarity to try to discover their true self or to get what it is that they want. And these movies, are reactionary in the sense that they don't actually have any kind of revolutionary potential. It's about the individual deciding that this world is so radically fallen that there's no point in actually trying to even invest yourself in it any longer. So the only thing to do is withdraw and look after yourself and try to rediscover some kind of spiritual element in your personal life. And I don't think that's what Adorno would approve of, right? What he wanted was a revolutionary kind of art that allowed you to connect your alienation or your sense of enemy to a broader struggle for collective emancipation or social emancipation, depending on how you want to frame it, which is why we have to be really careful in saying that just because something is genuinely a work of art, that doesn't mean it can't be a reactionary piece of art.
Right. Yes. And to add to that, to both what Eric and Matt said, Adorno is, I'll just sort of tweak one thing that Eric said, which is that, you mentioned how he was sort of into bourgeois art. I would say that he was, we kind of look back at classical music now and sort of think of it as one sort of homogenous thing, unless you're someone who's into music theory and history. It kind of seems that way, but it's not all bourgeois art. So Adorno was actually into modernist art, and Schoenberg, one of the reasons he liked Schoenberg is because that he was a radical challenge to tradition in music theory. And there's a great essay that Adorno wrote where he's comparing Stravinsky, who was originally a radical composer and then became more of a popular composer over time that became very nationalist, and comparing him to Schoenberg. And he's talking about what's really important for Adorno is that art remain radical. And so you'll see he often changes opinions on composers over historical time, not because of reasons of aesthetics, but because of reasons that they no longer were acting revolutionary in the composition of their works. Another thing I'll just sort of note too, on the topic of art, is that, I saw some comments on the culture industry video. People were saying, well, what about movies like Sorry to Bother You, which, I really liked Sorry to Bother You. It was made by Boots Riley, who is a communist. But I think this example is sort of a example of how the culture industry has permeated our lives so much that people think that everything that's a film or music comes out of the culture industry. Sorry to Bother You, as an example, was not a culture industry product. It was an independent film. And it got because it was an independent film, it got very limited theater play. And limited distribution and so forth. So that film was able to be revolutionary and have anti-capitalist themes because it was not a product of the culture industry. So there are still ways for art to work outside of the culture industry. It's just incredibly difficult because the culture industry dominates everything. And just one last point about that, which is that when we're talking about the culture industry, we're not just talking about Hollywood or, Sony, the big films, the big music labels and so forth. We're also talking about news media. News used to be separate from a profit-making endeavor. Ever since the 70s, media has come under the influence of corporate control. Now media is concentrated. News media is concentrated to 5 or 6 companies. It changes every now and then, but 5 or 6 companies that own all of 90% of news media. And I'm not talking about alternative press.
And Americans should be proud of their 7 companies that they have in the country.
Right. So this is how I'll finish up, but this is how the culture industry sort of maintains these ideological notions, is because these sorts of ideas are, in tandem with the news and where we get our information about politics, where we get our information about the world around us. So they work together, and there's a very intimate relationship between them.
No, I just want to say, I think people mainly accuse Adorno of being elitist because they figured if they had a copy of a Beatles record or something, you would just come in and smash it, right? It's like, how dare you own Abbey Road? Fuck that, right? Please me, go please your fucking boss, bitch. Bang.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even though we have alternative news sources like podcasts on both the right and left, Fox News gets 2 million views a day compared to even the most popular podcast, which might get Joe Rogan?
Yeah.
He'll get 1 million on a video over a month or two, I guess. But.
I mean, HBO and Netflix both have their Last Week Tonight and their Patriot Act, and they often shit on their companies that own them, right? But I consider those to be sort of semi-independent. But I think when Adorno, one of the later critiques is, they didn't really predict these independent value spheres that could emerge within the culture industry at the point they're writing. It's really when culture has just become, since before World War I, a little really just integrated into this totalizing system. And they do say that cultural monopolies are weak. The culture industry does not have ideological control unless it's backed by whom? By big steel, by chemical, by petroleum, and by electricity. Those are the industrial monopolies that support the existence of the culture industry. And you can think of this in terms of even today, the Koch brothers have a huge stake in Getty Images. So every time you use an image from Getty Images, you think you're just using a stock image, but no, you're using something that the Koch brothers own. And they really keep an eye on that shit. And you got to pay them money every time you use a stock image from Getty Images. So it's not that just the culture industry exists. There's a material base for that, and that is big steel, oil, chemical, and electricity, right? So those things are ever present today in our society as well. They have an overbearing presence over everything. And so even though there's independent value spheres that emerge and subcultures, the legacy of the 60s, we also still have that same underlying material base that enable all this stuff to happen. Like, where do the wires come from? Where do all the materials come from? Like, we're an independent value sphere just right here, but I'm sure the things that I bought that let me do this are owned by people I would not want to give my money to, but I have to anyway. And so I can produce some kind of nice counterculture dialogue with my money that I gave to Bill Gates or to whatever, whoever, fill in whatever semi-conspiratorial family rich name you want.
But I think you hit on a really good point about this, and I would actually just broaden it further by saying that one of the things that the cultural industry, according to Adorno, and like his later figures like Mark Fisher, what it does that's so effective is it's able to co-opt a lot of revolutionary forms of art and banalize them. I can't remember who actually coined that term. It might have been Fisher, right? And therefore, like, kind of gut them of revolutionary potential. And again, this isn't a conscious activity. It's something that savvy marketers are just really good at, right? They sit there and they say, oh, the youth of today are actually getting really riled up by this. So why don't we take it and transform it into something that's a little bit more commercial? And I remember SHALON did a really good presentation for my class maybe about a year and a half ago where she talked about this, right? And so I won't steal the examples, but just one that I sometimes think about because I'm a big fan is like punk music, right? You think about the Clash and Joy Division and a lot of the early bands, the Sex Pistols that had really revolutionary working class rage behind them. And you take that and you transform it into angry sounding music for the youth by the time the mid 80s comes along. And all of a sudden it's transformed into anthems that people will pay big dollars in order to go, enjoy it, right? As a kind of supplement to capitalism or as a substitute for genuine revolutionary activity, depending on how you interpret it, right? And
yeah, I mean,
it's really
I think
it's very effective.
Yeah, looking at punk and hip hop as good examples of how the culture industry co-ops countercultural movements. I mean, both punk and hip hop started as independent forms of cultural rebellion. But it was not long before, advertisers and the music industry realized their potential for profit making and completely essentially bought them up. And, we see this kind of throughout the history of 20th century music, especially. Adorno's always given a hard time, I have to say it. Adorno's always given a hard time about his takes on jazz. But people who kind of misunderstand that don't really understand either the music theory or the music history there. When Adorno's talking about jazz, he's saying that he's referring to the popular dance form of music that existed, in the 1940s, which, this is a time when, this isn't the jazz that people think of when they think of jazz. It's not cool jazz and bebop that came, later in the 50s. When Adorno's talking about this, he's talking about music like Glenn Miller and Lawrence Welk and jazz music that had been completely standardized and 100% became formulaic. And it was being picked up by the culture industry that was forming at this time. And you have the music industry, like ASCAP, BMI, that pretty much owns most of music. Those got their those formed in like 1940 abouts. So, you see this throughout all of the 20th century music and especially into the 21st century, where you'll see pockets of cultural rebellion. And that seems sort of promising, but then the culture industry, being the behemoth that it is, quickly can take these up and use them for their own purposes.
Or even to use the example you gave earlier on Joker, right? I mean, like you have Martin Scorsese movies and other kind of new wave films in the 1970s that I would say at their best did genuinely have some revolutionary potential, right? You think about Taxi Driver as a kind of anti-Vietnam War credo, analyzing the kind of depression that results from being in this highly Nixonite society, right? And then, it had a little bit of political heft to it. And then you take that and you transport it into 2019, and all of a sudden what you're just given is revolution about nothing, right? You're just angry. So here's a figure who can act as an anti-signifier for you to project all your animosities into. And hey, it's also a pop culture figure. So you know him, you're familiar with him, and he's a relatively comfortable person to do that with, right?
Oh, and it made billions of dollars, by the way.
Yeah. As opposed to Travis Bickle, where you sit there and you think, Green Beret, working a blue collar job, goes crazy and kills a bunch of people. That's a really uncomfortable person to actually have to think through these dynamics with, right? Which is part of what makes that movie relatively provocative.
So if we can get back to, we just did, I think we covered the culture industry there, and actually, you know what? This sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? It sounds like, Marxism didn't work, so now we're going to go find psychoanalysis because our theory has to be right about this behemoth thing. Anyway, we've done some, SHALON, we've done some work before about how we sound like conspiracy theorists if we were listening to ourselves from the outside. But back to the Marxist thrust of this whole thing. The whole Marxist thrust, the way I see it anyway, is this is a theory of why do we have so much and yet we're unhappy? I think at bottom, that's what all of them are trying to address. And as opposed to someone like Steven Pinker, who's like, Africa is making $4 a day now. Like, this is an improvement, So Marcuse says something basically like, if this were a rational system, we would have stopped overproducing a long time ago because we already had enough. We already have enough to be happy. And now the overproduction, the surplus, is just making us more unhappy. By the way, if you want to know more about Marcuse, I got a shout out to my friend on YouTube, Epoch Philosophy, who just released a video on it. I didn't finish it, so I can't vouch for the whole thing, but I can vouch for the first half. Anyway,
vouch for the name. The title is great.
Epoch Philosophy. So, yeah, like the idea that Marcuse has, and I think the rest of them sort of generally with this culture industry stuff, is if this were a rational system in the way that we kind of think of capitalism being rational, and the arguments that are made for capitalism being rational, like, look, it's better for everybody. It's not producing happiness in the end. So I was wondering what you guys read today, and SHALON, what you've read your entire life, or your entire career, I should say.
From the cradle, she was picking up a copy of negative dialectics, being like, "Oh, this is my future." While her parents were just spoon feeding her, being like, "Dialectic of enlightenment here."
No, SHALON was not happy until she read negative dialectics for the first time. I was just wondering what, like, in terms of applying Marxism today, and the way they do it, and the way we've tried to do it, and the way other people have done it. What do they speak to in terms of like human happiness, and what would a good system look like, and what are the things that we're missing? And we're doing critical theory, but how do we go just beyond like whining about the music industry and things like that?
This whole thing is fucked. It's like I think he says it somewhere. It's like we're the first society that has the capability. I mean, like the 20th century capitalist society is the first society that has the capability of, say, like ending world hunger, and we just fucking don't do it. Like, we're so deep in this ideology that it's not good for business. It doesn't conform to the profit motive of the culture industry, so we just don't fucking do it. And instead, we make movies about it because those make money. So that's a great fucking thought. I mean, when you come out of Adorno and Horkheimer, you just have this complete pessimism. There's nothing you can fucking do. What do you do? Like, okay, I can point the way, but that's not going to happen. Cool. I make art and it resolves tensions in an autonomous sphere. Is that ever going to be operationalized? No. But if you want to use it to study the history of culture, this is an amazing framework for, like, asking questions about 20th century industrial capitalism.
But the second wave critical theorists definitely tried to do this, right? I mean, we might not like their answers, and we can be very critical of this, but like you'd be hard pressed to say that like Axel, or second and third wave, I should say, you'd be hard pressed to say that like Habermas or Axel Honneth or Sheila Benhabib don't have answers to these problems, right? If anything, most of their career they've been trying to give answers to these, and the leftists hated them for it. So.
But I mean, if it's that easy, then why don't we just do it? Because that's the point.
Well, Matt, this is kind of what I'm asking. What is that answer? If you can,
I would
sketch
say
it
that
over.
the answer that logically follows from this, and I would say that, even though he's not perceived this way, a close reading of his works will reveal this, is that the only answer to this is a Marxist solution, which is revolution. Revolution in the sense of not just, pocketed rebellions and insurrections, but true revolution that upends capitalism altogether and establishes a communist society. Yes, at least, the early figures, I'm not as well versed in the later ones, but the early figures do have a pessimistic sense, and it does seem sort of doom.
But they're also
Adorno,
writing in like the best stage of capitalism. No one's going to revolt in 1950s USA.
Right. And
Well, you say that Martin Luther King did, right?
I shouldn't say 1950s USA was good for everybody, but Marshall Plan, Keynesian economics, oil boom, business was good on the whole.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I would not consider the civil rights movement the kind of communist revolution that Marxist would consider a true revolution. I mean, it was good. It changed a lot of the legal aspects, but if you study the civil rights period, you see there were all these ways that the government and everything stopped any sort of progresses. And this is, I think, goes to a point to today, which is that when you have people who try to work within capitalism, like, oh, we can reform capitalism, it's not going to work. The only answer is a sober one, which is it needs mass organization to truly upend capitalism and create a new system. And what that system looks like, and, not exactly sure. Marx was not clear on this either. And he, even talked about how that's the kind of thing that, those who change the society can determine. So in terms of happiness, I don't know the answer to that question. I think humans are sort of inherently unhappy regardless of time period. But in terms of living a life that, where you have food and shelter and you're not worked to death like a wage slave, that requires revolution. And, Adorno is, at the end of the day, a Marxist, even though he, is sort of in the realm of intellectual thought. That's always in the background of, his criticisms. He saw, thinking about these things, he saw radical thought as a radical move, that we first have to understand the problems and understand why capitalism is bad for all these reasons, because we have to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's why I say the theorists, they're primarily doing a descriptive thing. They're not prescriptive. Marx was descriptive. He was not primarily a prescription guy. He's not like, this is what you do. He's like, this is what's happening. It's description. It's social theory. You're trying to theorize what's going on because a better understanding of the society that you're in can lead to more targeted action, better, understanding. Like if we move, these guys are all about reason, right? But there's different forms of reason. There's the kind of instrumental rationality that capitalism applies to everything. And then there's a different form of rationality, a rationally organized society, which could work for everybody that they want to get at. But it's not really enough to just talk about it. We have to understand the conditions that we're in before we can, change them. in any meaningful way.
So who's going to do it? Not it.
Yeah. No, I understand. And this is where I'm going to push back a little bit on both of these comments, because I absolutely appreciate the task of, to use Eric's term, describing society rather than providing prescriptive guidelines, right? But I think that there's a problem inherent within that, which is that we can't necessarily abscond ourselves from the burdens of moral judgment and involving ourselves in the creative effort of trying to imagine what a better society would be. And this is where I think like somebody like Noam Chomsky or Habermas can be helpful, not necessarily because we should take their own specific solutions on board, but because they provide models for how this project could be undertaken and where it might go off the rails, right? And this is one of the things that I think is interesting and also problematic about the critical theory tradition as a whole, because a lot of the people who took up the Adornian challenge of trying to imagine a post-capitalist society ultimately came to the conclusion that there's really no way of doing that, right? If you think about somebody like Jürgen Habermas, right? Like his solution in the 1980s was that there's no way of actually overcoming the problems involved in steering the market economy through state or democratic action. So we just had to accept the persistence of the market as a constant feature in life and settle for something like a social democratic welfare state. Axel Honneth was a little bit more radical in saying that we need to emphasize something like social freedom as the basis of a common life that we create and share in common. But he never really was able to define that with a great deal of specificity beyond saying that this would be some kind of 21st century socialism.
Matt, I would really love to hear your manifesto for Habermasian reform.
No, I don't think so. I mean, what I endorse is something like liberal socialism, which is a little bit different, right? But what I'm just saying is that I do think there's this hunger on the part of critical theorists to provide something more than just descriptions of why it is that the world, if you want to put it bluntly, sucks, right? But we're not exactly willing to do that all that often, and many of the solutions that have been put forward aren't really all that radical a break from what we've seen before, which is why I think a lot of Marxists criticize them, right? But if people are going to criticize them, then the onus is on people with radical inclinations to at least provide some kind of prescriptive guidelines on how things would be better off if we take more drastic steps to overcome the status quo, if that makes sense.
What do you guys think? Because I really don't even want to step out on a limb here, but I was like reading Marcuse. It seems like something like UBI would be a big step towards people being able to use their leisure time creatively. Because one of the problems is like you don't hand to mouth, you're not going to spend any of that time investing in things that cost money beyond like Netflix, because it costs too much to like undertake a project. But if there were something like UBI, do you think that would not wage a revolution, but in some case make the possibility of leisure time be more valuable or be more meaningful?
Well, leisure time is work in the culture industry. It's just like work. You go to work, you go home, and then that's your leisure time. But what are you really doing? You're just like receiving the products of your work as like a collective member of the culture industry, which you're a part of. You just basically, you consume, and then you get into this stage where it's like, okay, I can fucking deal with another day of work. And then you go back to work. And then that's sort of like leisure just becomes just like work.
It's a recharge part of the work cycle. Yeah. But if you could make leisure creative, is that a step? If we can just make robots do all the factory jobs, say.
Well, I'm not opposed to something like UBI, but I think the fundamentally Marxist point here still stands, which is that what we don't just want is leisure time. What we want to feel is in control of the labor process. And the only way to actually achieve that is through a democratization of production, right? And you don't get that from a UBI, right? You don't get that by just saying like, well, you can either receive money or you can go into a workplace and you'll still be exploited and there'll still be people who are telling you what to do, but you might happen to make a little bit more money in those circumstances. This is where I think that Marx was really insightful, right? Where he said that one of the problems with bourgeois economists and even welfarist economists is that they only emphasize things like redistribution, right? And how it is to give people the money to do what they want. When what's also fundamentally important is looking at the production side of things And if we look there, we realize that people are still going to be exploited and people are still not going to be in charge of producing the kinds of things that they desire, or at least producing things that have market value in a democratic fashion. And that's what we need to challenge, right? So I'll be in favor of a UBI because I think that would be a big improvement on things. But I definitely don't think it would challenge the underlying problem, which is the fact that many of us work for crappy bosses and in crappy situations where we don't feel in control of our actions. And if we're still going to spend 8-9 hours a day doing that, then not a lot's going to change by just giving people the option to opt out and live on $1,600 a month. Okay?
All right. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to give the final word as long as you want, Shalon.
Oh no.
But we're gonna. You can wrap up the discussion. Tell us what you
bring us home.
Tell us what you hope for. Tell us what Adorno hoped for, if not you.
Well, I think that to wrap it up, I mean, I think we have to be conscious of things like the culture industry, of how things that, I mean, we see, I think the last statistic I saw was that the average person sees about 5,000 ads a day. So we are inundated with a day. Yes.
Wow.
So we are inundated with constant pressures to consume. And I think the first step is to just sort of be aware of it. And that's where Adorno can come in. But we can't really stop there. And in my opinion, we need to focus on creating a mass workers' party and really organizing to work towards changing this. And, if you want to start on a small level and thinking in terms of art, you can think about supporting independent artists. And I don't mean like quote unquote indie artists that are really just put out by Hollywood, but I mean like actual independent art. But you can't just consume your way out of these problems. These problems, the very thing that, all of at least the early Frankfurt School is talking about is problems with capitalism. And, the early ones were Marxist, and they were saying, look, capitalism causes these problems. Marxists in the past have talked about the political and economic problems that capitalism has caused. We're also looking at the cultural and psychological problems that capitalism causes. All right, so now we know there are all these things that are problems with capitalism. So what next? I think what we have to think about as Marxists is how to unpend it, how to get rid of it, and how to move forward. And I think that's all I can really say as what we can take away from critical theory.
All right, Eric and Matt, do you have anything that's less than a minute? And I mean that.
I do. And that's that I really like the Beatles, and whatever Adorno says about them, I stand by at least every one of their post-65 records. So that's my final statement on the matter.
I think cars, bombs, and movies keep our society going around. So keep those things coming. Cars, bombs, movies, drive to school, give them your money, they invest in the weapons, and then go home and watch a movie.
So are you saying like Michael Bay is the ultimate producer in our economy?
Yeah, or like all hail Avatar and the unfulfilled promises of that fucking movie, which there's going to be like 4 more of those, I think, or something like that. So
they are starting 2022. Apparently, there's going to be an Avatar movie a year.
So I'm looking forward to more unfulfilled culture industry promises.
Red Letter Media was the critical theory of today. So.
There you go.
All right, from Eric, Matt, and Pills, we'd like to thank Shalon. Go to her site, which I have linked, if you would like to see more of her stuff, now having heard her. Thanks, Shalon, for coming. It was great.
Thanks so much for having me.
I don't know if I'm happier or sadder than when we started.
Despite
this being a product of labor. Actually, labor supported by the mass of patrons. Anyway, thank you very much, Eric, Matt, I will see you guys later, and you guys can hit your record buttons.
It
Ow!